I can hear the floor creak beneath me. What is up, guys? So today we're actually going to be doing a video that I started doing last month, but it was kind of late in the month, and it makes a lot more sense that we do this early on, especially a lot of you guys pointed that out. And then, you know, when the idea struck, I did it as soon as I could, and it makes a lot more sense to do it now rather than like 2 weeks from now, when, you know, the Nightmare Cup gets going. Anyways, so we're going to be taking a look at the top 5 best fighting Pokemon in the Cup. Now, I do want to put a small disclaimer here. Most of the numerical stats are from my own spreadsheets. All of the simulations were all done using pvpoke.com, and even this viability list comes from there. So, you've been warned. So when looking at the top 5 fighting Pokemon, there are some kind of surprising finds here, but then again, there are some completely duh kind of moments here. So let's go through this in the same way that I started doing the research for this video. First thing I did is I started and went through and looked at the bulk and the stat product of every fighting type Pokemon that's allowed inside of the Nightmare Cup. Of course, this excludes things like Hitmonchan and fighting legendaries, fighting mythicals. Do they even exist? Buzzwole. So looking at these stats, we do actually end up having an identical list for the top 5. Okay, so Poliwrath is the bulkiest and has the most stat product out of all of the fighting types. Hitmontop coming in second. Hariyama coming in third, Machoke actually comes in fourth, and Hitmonchan finishing up in the 5th slot. Now, when we're talking strictly about bulk, my boy Heracross does come in 6th, but when we talk about stat product, he kind of goes like down to like 10th or 11th or something like that. Since I just got a comment that basically said I didn't talk about Heracross, every time that I say Heracross in this video, I will zoom in on my buddy Heracross right there. So the next thing that I look at whenever I determine these best of top 5 typings is I go to PvPoke and I look at the rankings list, how good these Pokemon are in general. Filter it by fighting types, and you get these top 5 fighting types in terms of viability. Now, viability is a key word here, because when I say viability, I'm talking about how good they are up against the entire cup. I'm not talking about like this fighting type Pokemon is the best in this role. Like the roles are going to change just a slight bit between each Pokemon depending on their moveset and that kind of thing. But in terms of just a typing, the top 5 viable Pokemon, in my opinion, are here. So we do have Lucario bringing in the top slot, which is a no surprise kind of deal here. Of course, Counter, Power Up Punch, and Shadow Ball seems to be the best moveset. You do cover the most amount of matches with that moveset in this cup. Next, we actually have Machamp coming in second, which actually carries Counter, Cross Chop, and Rock Slide. So Cross Chop there is a legacy move, which does kind of make this a little bit harder to obtain, but not nearly impossible. Next, we do have Toxicroak, which actually carries Counter, Mud Bomb, and Dynamic Punch. Of course, if you used Toxicroak back in the Twilight Cup, then hey, you kind of have a free fighting type for this month. Fourth is actually Primeape, which is just that is mind-boggling to me. I don't really understand how Primeape inches out some of these other Pokemon, but based solely on the numbers, that's what happens. Primeape having Counter, Cross Chop, and Night Slash. Of course, here again, Cross Chop is a legacy type move, so it may be kind of harder to obtain a Cross Chop Primeape, but not nearly impossible. Last but not least, we do have Hitmonchan, which actually has Counter, Power Up Punch, and Fire Punch is actually favored in a lot of these matchups according to PvPoke, which is kind of interesting considering that Fire doesn't really hit anything super effectively unless you have a couple of those Ice types like Weavile, but even then, it's not super crazy in this cup. I would think maybe further on in the meta, Ice Punch actually may become more useful, because once we get to all these names that are written up here, There's one in particular that I think may end up being a really big threat in the near future, so we may end up wanting to switch that to Ice Punch, but only time will tell. Now, moving on to our gigantic list of names over here. I'm very sorry if some of these are hard to read. I tried to cram as many as I could. Basically, the top 4 are going to be your dark types. The next 4 are going to be the psychics, and the last 4 are going to be the fighting types. So this kind of gives you an idea of all of the Pokemon in the cup matched up against these top 5 fighting type Pokemon. And the reason that I wrote all these names up here is because there's an interesting little pattern amongst some of these. So, a lot of people are going to be saying this month, oh my god, Lucario's back, he's got Power Up Punch, he's so OP, I can't hatch one. Look, I will actually tell you, in this cup, you can actually see he actually loses to every single fighting type Pokemon in a 1v1 shield situation in this entire cup. He loses to all of them. All of them. Yes, that is correct. So while Lucario is extremely good, he is very easily countered by his own typing. So always remember, even though you may not have the Lucario this month, it's definitely not a have to have. You can definitely go with a smaller bit of anti-meta in this slot and still do extremely well, considering that these other 4 Pokemon besides Lucario have really great matchups against some of the other types out there. Lucario, while he does inch out as the best, most viable Pokemon, he definitely is not a absolute have to have. You will do just fine if you don't have one. I promise. So let's actually go over Lucario here for a second. So as you notice, once we start to get through these Pokemon, I start to try to change up the matchups that we have, because when we're talking fighting up against the dark types, of course all of the dark types are going to start to just keep reappearing. So I did try to throw in a couple of things that were different here and there. Now Lucario has an interesting matchup against all of the dark types. He beats every single one of them except for Houndoom. Houndoom is an interesting dark type to have because he has access to a lot of fire types that get stabbed. He actually ends up being able to do quite a bit of super effective damage against Lucario, which ends up meaning Lucario has a hard time going around Houndoom. Kind of interesting. Moving on to our psychic types for Lucario. So Chimecho and Xatu both end up falling to our Lucario here, but we actually have a really, really bad time up against Mr. Mime and Gardevoir. So Gardevoir is going to be seen a lot. If you actually notice, Gardevoir is on every single one of these. Yeah, Gardevoir actually does really, really well up against all of the fighting types. It's really, really good. Plus it has access to Shadow Ball, which helps it cover some of the other psychic types. So definitely want to be looking into Gardevoir here. I also want to maybe do a versus on Gardevoir versus Gallade. Keep an eye out for that. Now in terms of our fighting, just like I said earlier, Lucario loses to all of the fighting types in a 1v1 shield situation. Most notably, Heracross is the best counter towards Lucario. Yes, my boy Heracross is going to be featured in this cup. When I went to Mexico, I got a Heracross. I actually got 3, and I'm super excited. It's already on my team. There's no doubt in my mind it's going on my team. You can't talk me out of it. And then of course here, Toxicroak, Machamp, and Hitmonchan all actually end up doing really, really well up against our Lucario, which means that Lucario ends up failing to overcome any of the other fighting types. So, while Lucario is amazing, don't fear him nearly as much in this cup as you would have in the Kingdom Cup. Moving on to Machamp here. So Machamp actually brings in a very interesting flying type Pokemon that I was talking about earlier. Honchkrow actually ends up having a really, really good matchup up against our Machamp. We end up losing to Honchkrow, but we actually have favorable matchups pretty much to everything else. Even Houndoom makes an appearance here as we end up beating Houndoom, something that actually gives Lucario a lot of trouble. Next, we actually have our psychic types, and Alolan Raichu kept appearing in these lists, which I saw a lot of people talking about it in the first couple of hours that the cup was announced. And while it does have some merit in some situations, it actually loses to a lot of these fighting types, which is interesting. Moving on, we actually do end up losing up against the Gardevoir, Hypno, and Kadabra. So both Gardevoir and Hypno are going to be featured a lot in these lists, even if I don't write Hypno down for Metacham. Rest in peace, Metacham. Even if I don't write down Hypno for Hitmonchan, he does still end up beating Hitmonchan. It's just I tried to add a little bit more variety to the names up here on the list. Pulling in at our fighting types. So Gallade actually right here. Gallade starts to appear quite a bit because Gallade has fighting and psychic typing, which actually makes it quite interesting to go up against as a fighting type. So he actually does really well up against all of our fighting types up here, but he may actually be the most anti-meta fighting type in the list. If you were going straight anti-meta, Lucario is a big deal. Gallade might be a really good option there. And then you actually cover a lot of the other fighting types as well. So hardcore anti-meta option there. Of course, Machamp actually does end up beating Lucario, Poliwrath, and Blaziken actually, which is kind of interesting. I mean, Poliwrath is going to be pretty interesting if you can get a hold of one with Mud Shot. Considering it has Power Up Punch, that's a really big move, but kind of interesting that Machamp can actually take that out in a 1v1 situation there. Next, we move on to Toxicroak, and Toxicroak here actually has some kind of interesting matchups for himself. Carrying that poison typing really does have some interesting things that can happen. But notably, as a fighting type, he actually does really well up against a lot of the dark types. Alolan Raticate and Umbreon, of course, are going to be pretty much losing to all of these, but very noteworthy that they both lose here, while Honchkrow and Spiritomb actually can end up beating the Toxicroak. Kind of interesting since we just talked about Spiritomb. In terms of Psychics, we do have Alolan Raichu being the best possible outcome for Toxicroak, but remember Toxicroak being quad weak to Psychic. Remember that Venomoth matchup was just, it was horrible to try to go up against. That means that all of those Psychic types really have a good matchup up against Toxicroak. Gardevoir, Mr. Mime, and Hypno most notably are the hardest counters to Toxicroak there. Talk a little bit about these fighting types here. So Gallade makes another appearance. We actually can still end up beating Lucario. We beat Breloom and Hitmonchan. A lot of the fighting types don't really have too much of a problem with Toxicroak, but it's kind of, you know, fighting against fighting is kind of neutral. So there's a few ties and a couple of other things inside of that matchup for Toxicroak as well. Now, Primeape is an interesting one. Like we talked about just a minute ago, Primeape was the one that really just blew my mind. Having access to Night Slash maybe helps a lot in some of the Psychic type matchups, but even then I wouldn't have thought that it would have been that good to warrant number 4 on this list. But here we are. So the only dark type that actually ends up beating Primeape is actually Honchkrow. Of course, we talked about Honchkrow before. He's actually going to be pretty good up against a lot of these fighting types, and then he also helps cover a lot of these Psychic types as well. So pretty interesting. We actually do end up winning up against Drapion, Umbreon, and Weavile, though all of those falling pretty hard to us. Now, Primeape actually up against the Psychics here ends up having wins against Alakazam. So a lot of people have already been requesting an Alakazam deep dive, and I can tell you that Alakazam appearing in this list, having hard times going up against the fighting type, really makes me weary about his mainstay in the meta. I don't know how good he's actually going to be if the typing that he's supposed to be best at he has a hard time with. I don't know. That's off the tongue. I don't know for sure how good he's going to be. We'll get to it. So beating Alakazam, but we actually end up losing against Mr. Mime, Gardevoir, and Hypno here again. So the exact same trio that end up taking out most of all of these top 5 here. Pulling into our fighting types though, Gallade of course makes a reappearance, Poliwrath, Hitmonchan, and even Infernape starts to show here that Infernape has good matchups up against Primeape. Last but not least, we come up on our boy Hitmonchan here. So the only dark type that actually gives Hitmonchan any trouble is actually Spiritomb. Umbreon, Mightyena, and Tyranitar all end up having a abysmal time up against our Hitmonchan. They don't really stand a chance. Next, into our Psychic typings, here again, Alakazam makes an appearance. Gardevoir, Xatu, and even Slowking all show up as really good up against the Hitmonchan there. Moving into our fighting types, Machamp actually makes a reappearance here. Machamp actually ends up beating the Hitmonchan, which is kind of interesting because we were talking about going up against flying types with Hitmonchan earlier, maybe wanting to use that ice type. But Machamp actually still has access to Rock Slide, so while it's not horrible, it could actually outdo the Hitmonchan situation. If most people are choosing to go with Hitmonchan, you can actually cover some of the flying type with your rock type damage while also being able to cover the Hitmonchan, which is interesting if that scenario ever arises. Of course, the flying type damage is going to be super effective to you, so you basically like need to farm that energy somewhere else and then use it on a flying type, but either way. Poliwrath actually ends up beating Hitmonchan. I'm sure that's literally just because Mudshot ends up gaining energy so freaking fast that you get to Power Punch, and you just clobber over Hitmonchan there. Lucario and Hitmontop are actually favorable matchups for you, though. It's interesting that Hitmonchan actually beats Hitmontop when Hitmontop has more bulk and stat product than Hitmonchan. So there is a really good example of the moves make or break you here. So if I haven't made my point clear enough, Heracross is the #1 fighting type, hands down. You shouldn't even consider choosing anyone else. Please, please go get yourself a Heracross right now. So that is actually my take on the top 5 best fighting types in the Nightmare Cup. Of course, it's still extremely early. The meta is very underdeveloped at the moment, so all of this could shift depending on when you're watching this video. All of this information could be complete garbage at this point, or it could actually stand, which would be interesting. Definitely, takeaways from this video is Lucario. If you've already got one from the Kingdom Cup, you're solid on fighting types. You shouldn't really have to worry. If you're still working on getting a Lucario, there are several other options that are very, very much more available than the Lucario that are still just as good and beat Lucario. So that is actually it for today, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out. Thank you so much for watching. Always remember, if you have any kind of deep dives that you're looking forward to, please comment down below. I'd love to put them on the spreadsheet and tally them up and get them on there. So up on the list, actually Lucario has the most votes at the moment, and then it's Bronzong, I'm pretty sure, is next. But here's the thing, I'm going to do 2 more of these typing videos to round out and go ahead and get all these out of the way. I'm going to do the fighting one, as you just saw, and then I'm going to tackle, I'm pretty sure just do Psychic next and then do Dark last. And then we'll tackle all of those 3, get them out of the way, and then we'll start back into our deep dives. Kind of let these votes build up so that I have a nice little pool of information to work with so that it's a little bit more balanced, if you will. So as always, guys, thank you so much for watching. If you like to like videos, make sure you do that. If you don't, you can be that guy. Otherwise, let me know what you have to say down in the comments about my Heracross. Otherwise, you can leave.